Welcome to the Mystic-Skeptic radio show and podcast, the program in which we ask the tough questions and explore different alternatives to today's pressing issues, theories, or enigmas. Our show is devoted to the exploration of all things mystical, philosophical, scientific, political, conspiratorial, and cosmic. Join us in an exploration of the Mystic-Skeptic mind space. Welcome to the Mystic and the Skeptic. In this show, we will be discussing a very difficult subject. I will be reading my article that I wrote for a website or blog. It's called Hasan Minaj and the Palestinization of Protest. In the last few years, I have struggled to talk about this Israel-Palestine conflict in fear of alienating any of my listeners. I've had Zachary Foster as a guest on my show. He's the host of Middle East Tonight. He often defends Palestinian rights by making a case that the Palestinians are not able to defend themselves against the superpower that the State of Israel has become. I respect his perspective, but I must address the inconsistencies with this movement as it becomes more popular among young people in the United States. First time I ever heard the accusation that Palestinian victimization under the Israeli government was the same as the plight of poor African Americans who have died by police brutality was on KPFK's radio show Rising Up with Sonali called Hakhtar. Exploiting one tragedy to support the predominant pro-Palestinian narrative would be acceptable if there were no caveats. However, this does not seem to matter to some commentators in the progressive movement. The latest celebrity to follow suit is Hasan Minaj, the popular comedian who made the following remarks on his Netflix show Patriot. We can't fathom that the same knee of oppression that kills in Gaza can be the same knee of oppression that killed George Floyd. He said this during a passionate speech in his episode We Cannot Stay Silent about George Floyd. After conflating Muslims and Asian immigrants who live in the US, he said these words. What is most concerning is that he ignores the politically charged aspect of his monologue and assumes that his viewers are not aware of the history of the radical Middle Eastern groups' aggression against Israelis and how the militant wing of the progressive movement often takes out their frustration on American Jews. He knows better than to make this irresponsible comparison as a child of immigrants from India. And India is an influential and maligned country among the vast Muslim hegemony in that area of the world. It's important to consider his claim to find out if it's true. I often ask myself, why do progressives often conveniently ignore the Saudi, Iranian, Syrian, or Lebanese proxy war that takes place in the Holy Land by individuals or whole regimes supporting this militant groups in the Palestinian territories? There's also the need to suppress acts of violence. The reason that I started with this introduction is because we know that the groups such as Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or I think it's called Justice for Palestine on campus and groups like that, they have been very vocal, and sometimes they say things that are very offensive to certain people. So, but then on the other side, you have groups that support Israel who also do some things. The problem is that when you start talking about annihilating groups and wanting to get rid of people altogether, that's when you get in trouble. So for some reason, some people feel that it's okay for one group to say it and not for the other. So again, I'm not trying to stir up any trouble. I'm trying to work through this very complicated issue. And then now there's this idea that because there hasn't been any positive response to allegations of crimes, war crimes, or unjust treatment of Palestinians in either checkpoints or in these areas that are claimed to be part of the new, either the original or the new country of Palestine, as however people define it, that the same thing happens here when you have a force that goes into Black neighborhoods that is not local. But we've seen also that there's been mistreatment from fellow members of their own community who happen to be cops. So that's why my case is that there's a culture of mistreatment of poor people or even criminal individuals, and there's always this appropriate response to their actions. And that's similar to what people claim is happening in the Holy Land. It was a very passionate speech. So he was saying, we as South Asians, or we as Asians, or we as Muslims, we discriminate African Americans. We discriminate darker people within our own ethnic groups. And then we want to stay silent right now because we do not think that the protesters are acting politely or in their own interest or the way that someone should. But what he was saying is that enough is enough, and that people have to be able to accept that that we have freedom to protest, and even in places where you don't have freedom to protest, such as the Middle Eastern countries or Asian countries where you have people standing in front of tanks or being dispersed in similar or worse ways, being hit by sticks like you do in Turkey. Sometimes they even send terrorists to attack protesters. And then he mentioned throwing rocks at tanks, which it always sounds like a bad idea. He said that that's why you have to connect the suffering of the Palestinian people with the suffering of African Americans, because it's the same type of suffering of oppression. I have some concerns about that, and you'll hear it in the rest of my introduction. But it always goes back to, is it systemic? Is it systemized? Is it something that is targeted, or is it something that happens when things get out of hand? And that's what Rabbi Tarlow will discuss, and the questions that I'm raising. To say that the same type of oppression that is happening in Israel, the same type of oppression that racist cops, and that's what he means, is happening here, so it's to equate that racism is the cause of whatever Palestinian pain and suffering and loss of life that is happening over there. And that's my concern, because it's very easy for people to equate all Jews with all Israelis, with specific Israelis, with individual Israelis. And that's the first thing that the Muslim community complains about, that it's easy to conflate one Muslim, one bad Muslim, one domineering and who wants to take over the world for specific ideology, with all Muslims, all peace-loving servants of God. And that's what we're trying to get away from. So when you make these very simplistic comparisons and you say that the same type of killing is happening in a very volatile area of the Middle East, then that's where it becomes worrisome. And I think he's very smart and very able to see the differences. And I'm sure that he's being pressured that he hasn't spoken on behalf of the Palestinian community. So it is his duty to do that. So, for me, my duty as we fight anti-Semitism and racism of any kind is that we also break down the barriers and the misunderstandings and misinformation that happens. So again, it's not a personal issue, it's about ideas and how ideas affect people. And you'll see me getting into it with Rabbi Tarlow regarding his perspective in some senses, because he uses very all or nothing perspective. And I know that people who have been through difficult times, that's what they tend to do. And we see that with the protesters, where it's like, if you don't agree with them, you must be part of the problem. But we have to step back, because that type of us versus them creates more havoc when we're already in a very difficult situation. We're in the middle of the protests and the tragedy that happened in Minneapolis, and it's easy for people to get very radical about their perspectives. And I want to take a step back and kind of talk about this aspect of where does police brutality come from. And we've already done a show when we first started this program where we discussed the culture in the police departments, but there's been this thing going around different YouTube videos and documentaries where there's a push to militarize the police, to have this warrior training that involves always kind of fighting for your life. And then somehow that gets connected to the Israeli training that happens I shared with you that my cousin in Mexico had some training as a police officer from Israeli unit that came. As far as I knew, it was always related to counterterrorism. I know that's your specialty, if you can tell us a little bit about that. But what do you know about the connection between American police departments and Israeli, almost like ambassadors that come and share some of their knowledge of how to deal with
I think before we go there, we should talk a little bit just about some of the assumptions that are being made ever since Minneapolis. I happen to be the chaplain for my police department.
Yeah.
I've been the chaplain for 35 years. I'm out in the middle of the night when it's pouring rain and someone's mother or father has died or a child has died, and we sit there freezing in the cold winter taking care of small children. And that's much more policing than what happened in Minneapolis. So one, I think we need to really take some steps back. First of all, we could call what's going on in the United States right now the March of the Morons. It is amazing how little Americans know. They don't. Yesterday in Wisconsin, they tore down the statue of an abolitionist. They said, well, it's old, so it doesn't really matter. They beat up a Democratic member of the legislature who was gay and pro anti-police, and then the crowd beat him up because they said, well, he was walking there, so we'll just beat him up. So one of the first things I think we have to do is, even before we begin to discuss Israel or the United States, is talk a little bit about really what policing is about. Yes, there are bad apples. I'm certainly not going to deny that. But for every bad officer, there's probably 200 to 300 who are willing to risk their life to save you. And that's the part that, for some reason, our media has forgotten to talk about. I think probably the perfect example of this is what happened 2 days ago in Olympia, Washington. The mayor was very anti-police until the crowd attacked her house. And then she said, well, BLM she stopped being for them. All of a sudden she said, you know what? They're a bunch of terrorists. In other words, not as long as they beat up you, it's okay. The moment they beat up me, it's not so good. If they burn your house down, I don't care. They burn my house down, that's now terrorism. So one, what we really see is the people involved in most of these stuff are wealthy, white, rich liberals who could not care at all about Black people. And how do we know that? Because what's going on in Seattle, where you've had now 4 people shot and 1 person raped. And you know what? They could care less. And the people who were shot were Black. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we don't really mean Black Lives Matter. We mean some Black Lives Matter. Lots of other Blacks' lives don't matter. Now, if I look at that in the same way when we look at the Israel-Palestinian situation, first of all, even the term Palestinian is a make-believe term. It was developed by marketers in 1967. Prior to that, the only Palestinians were Jews, and Jews were always called Palestinians. But then someone said, you know what, let's create a new marketing device. So they created, and then it's a very good marketing device, but it has no basis in reality. But let's go with it anyway, just because that's the nomenclature right now. That's the story. So most Israelis go out of their way to be the most moral, ethical country on the face of the earth. Now, is there every once in a while some Israeli soldier who loses his temper or a police officer who does something wrong? Sure. And you know what happens? They're brought to court, they're court-martialed, they're put in jail, they're punished, just like any other person in the state of Israel. But our media, especially the white, rich, liberal media, and it's always interesting, it's always done by white, rich people because they don't have to worry about it ever happening to themselves. They've never spent any time in the slums or any time with the Latino community. I do, but they don't. I have lots of friends who are Mexican Americans. When I speak to my white liberal friends, they've never had a meal with them. They've never sat down and talked to them. And I'm the head of the International Security Division, Jefe de Seguridad, for the Mexican Tourism Police. I'm in Mexico City all the time. And, when you look at the world through Mexican eyes, real Mexican eyes, it's very different than what's presented in our world here. So, having said that, yes, there are people in Israel who are not good. If everyone were good, there wouldn't be police. I mean, I tell people when I take them to Israel, it's a holy land, but not everybody here is holy. Now, usually the government of Mexico, when it brings Israeli police to Mexico, gives them the temático, it gives them the themes that they want them to look at, and gives them says, okay, we want you to teach this, this, and this. It is almost always counterterrorism. That's what the Mexican government asks of the Israeli police. That doesn't mean that that's all the Israeli police do. Now, obviously, Israeli police do have to worry about terrorism. It's a country surrounded by enemies who very quickly would kill everyone there if they could. But that's like 1/100th of everything that police officers do. It means delivering food to the poor. It means taking care of children. Anyone who spent time in Israel knows that the police often are the ones who walk children to daycare centers, which are bombed and have to be with bomb-proof roofs in order to make sure that children are not killed. And when rockets come across the border, they are often aimed at kindergartens and daycare centers. Again, the people who like to criticize wouldn't want that to happen to their children, but underneath it, it's really racism. And what we see is double racism. We see racism on the part of white liberals against Blacks and Latinos. We see racism against the police. And a perfect picture was 2 days ago in Washington, D.C., where white liberal people were swearing at Black officers. And the Black officers stood there and took it and were told that they were awful human beings. And they were the ones defending them, not the other way around. So I think before we go, we have to question some of those assumptions, because those assumptions are wrong. And if you have wrong assumptions, just like in statistics, a wrong assumption will lead to a wrong equation, will lead to a wrong answer. Garbage in, garbage out. So that's my beginning salvo.
Well, we play this show on a very progressive station. And right before my show is actually the show who attacks Israel the most. Is called Law and Disorder. And all they do is discuss their concerns and issues with what's going on in the state of Israel. So I don't want to only talk about that. What I want to talk about is that, like you said, if there's an assumption that there's already an unjust system or an unjust group of people in an area that doesn't belong to them or whatever is being pushed, then everything else that comes out of that is destructive or negative. So I posted, there's 2 Facebook groups that I'm part of, and you're going to get mad at me, but there's Jews for Bernie, and then there's Americans Fighting Anti-Semitism.
Right.
And I post things in both groups because I'm an independent and I have issues with both liberals and conservatives. And usually you get the most extreme on both sides, but I want to talk to like the middle of the road person, the reasonable person. So my biggest concern when people say, well, we know that there's bad things happening in the Middle East and we know that it's the Israelis that are doing it that is wrong, is that it comes from an assumption that there should never be war, there should never be conflict, you should never defend yourself. It's kind of like this hippie mentality where if somebody throws bullets at you, you should give them flowers. This type of extreme perspective. And like you said, most people wouldn't put up with that, but it is like a purity test that unless you agree with those basic principles, you're a bad guy. And then sometimes I feel that in the conservative movement is the other way around, that if you don't defend yourself, you are a weak person and you have no spine. So what is the middle ground where we can make sense of?
So what's the middle ground if I want to shoot you?
I guess.
Tell me the middle ground. Are you half dead? There is no middle ground. Between life and death, there's no middle ground.
Okay.
Now, when people on your progressive station, the group before you, they're basically racists. They're basically pro-Hitler. They don't want to hear that, But remember, Hitler was on the left, not on the right. If you look at Hitler's policies, they were pure leftist economic policies, and then he threw in a little anti-Semitism to spice up the package. But if we look at what's now going on in the United States, even before we get to the other sub issues, look at the parallels between 1938 and 2020. Kristallnacht, the breaking of glasses, the refusal to accept a second opinion, the assumption that I'm right and you're wrong, and if you disagree with me, I have the right to kill you. The assumption of forcing major corporations to give large donations to a group of people who are basically racist to begin with. Now, you cannot have racism only for one group of people. The basic assumption of the Arab-Israeli conflict is simple. Jews don't have a right to be alive. And that's the assumption that starts with Hitler and comes to the program prior to yours. That if you make and the question I have to ask people who are anti-Israel is, very simply, do you believe Jews are human beings? And when I really press them, the bottom line is no. Well, you know something? I can't have a discussion with you if you don't accept my humanity. You could not have a discussion with Hitler. And remember, many liberals and progressives supported Hitler. And then they said, oh, maybe it didn't turn out quite the way we thought it would. Now, I know we are in an ahistorical period, but let's look at history over the last 2,000 years. You can't, again, what's the answer? What is the middle road between life and death? Do I just remove your arms and legs, but let you breathe? Is that acceptable? Do I wound you? Do I beat you to a pulp and let you just breathe and say, well, that's the middle road. I didn't kill you. I just beat you up. How would you act if I said it to your children? Can I kill your kids?
But since we're talking about Hitler, let me bring up an interesting point. So we've had Eric Kirklander, who's an expert on the 1930s, and his perspective was that he started off using like liberal propaganda, and then with time, since he couldn't get any traction, he started becoming more conservative or using conservative language to win people over Hitler. And that he was just throwing stuff around to see what would stick with the German population. Your perspective is different than that?
Yes. I disagree.
He was a socialist, like a modern
what is Nazism? What does that mean in German?
We know it's the Nationalist Socialist Party.
Oh, socialism.
Right.
Well, socialism.
Since we're talking about
what were the key elements of socialism, and how different are they from Bernie Sanders?
So you're talking about everybody having access to certain resources, or you're talking about the government owning?
We had the Volkswagen. Everyone was to have a car.
Okay.
The government was to own everything. Take out the anti-Semitism. Just take that little part out of it and look at all the rest of it. And Hitler and people who are for Bernie Sanders were basically the same issue. When I hear people speak for Bernie Sanders, they don't want to deal with facts. Notice when I asked you the question, what is the compromise between life and death? You couldn't answer it.
Right.
What is the difference? If I say to you, I want to kill your children, what's your reaction? I don't think your children have a right to be alive. Now, what's your reaction?
To defend them.
Oh, now you're conservative.
Right.
You went to an extreme.
Well, let me ask you this. So I'm aware of
by your definition, not by my definition, by the way. That was by your definition.
Okay. So I know of an incident that happened at Texas A&M. Is your alma mater, or where you taught for many years?
Yes, I taught. I'm not my alma mater, but I taught. Yes.
So they had Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi, speaking there.
Right.
And your successor, rabbi, told him that his understanding of Judaism was wrong, and that he needed to sit down with him and talk about it. But the one thing that Richard Spencer tried to throw at him was, I love Israel because Israel it focuses on the survival of his own people. They're nationalists, just like we are nationalists, wanting to have a white country in the U.S.
Right.
How would you respond to such a foolish notion?
First of all, I wouldn't have said that publicly to Richard Spencer. I think that's my successor was not a brilliant politician, and Richard Spencer is a master at wordsmithing and manipulation of words. So one, you don't get yourself in that type of argument. Secondly, most Israelis are not nationalists. But Israel is a much more liberal country than the United States. When you look at the conservative parties in Israel, we would call them about where Nancy Pelosi is. So the spectrum is much more in Israel to the left than it is to the right. Thirdly, every poll in Israel has said that they able to actually sit down, and we have proof of this, with Arab countries and come up to a peace agreement, that most Israelis would give up almost everything. Now we know that's true because Menachem Begin, who was on the right, when he sat down with Sadat, and it was a peace treaty for the Sinai, which was huge and put the country into somewhat of a dangerous situation, 90% of the population supported Begin in going for a peace treaty. The same thing has happened with the Jordanians. Now, the real issue is not nationalism or non-nationalism. The real issue comes down to a basic question. Do Jews have a right to be alive? And unless that question is answered, everything else becomes silly. It's just, we're playing with words. But if my basic assumption is you're not truly a human being, you're a subhuman being, which is racism, then everything else falls apart. So if you ask your friends in the program just prior to yours, really pin them to the wall, am I a human being? In the end, if you really push them, the answer would be no, you're not. Because your friends are racists.
Well, I know that there's demonization on both sides, and it's easy to knock someone down.
No, I'm not trying to demonize. I'm giving you pure academic facts.
Right, but my fear is that if you keep demonizing the liberals and calling everybody socialist, and then the other side says that everybody who supports conservative perspectives is a Nazi and this and that, then when the real demons come out, such as Farrakhan, or the people who are saying now that it's the Israelis' fault that the police is being brutal, that you can't tell the difference. If everybody is bad, then how can you tell when the...
First of all, I don't think you have to say everybody's bad. Secondly, I was speaking about how most Israelis are really good. Thirdly, I work with the police. Now, what I do see, though, is extremists, and especially extremists on both sides, which means you have Ku Klux Klan on one side, and you have extreme liberals on the other side. And those two sides tend not to want to look one at the other. But if I'm asked to analyze it, you have to analyze it academically. So we have to sit down and actually look at Mein Kampf and look at and compare it to Bernie Sanders' economic policies. That's not demonizing. That's just fact. That's that. He has his policy and he has his right to his policies. And I don't and I would certainly support his right to his policies. What I don't support is someone saying, but you are intrinsically evil because you don't support me. And if we're looking at what now is going on in the United States, what we're seeing is there cannot be a dialogue when one side says the other side is intrinsically evil. So I think you're giving me a false equation. I don't know many people on the conservative side who are not willing to talk. If we looked at what happened with the crazy thing with the noose that was supposedly found in the garage in wherever it was, in Alabama or wherever it was, and everybody began, oh no, it's got to be a noose. And then they said, oh no, it's just it's something to open the garage door, to pull down the garage door. Or the mayor of Oakland, who went into this huge insanity about nooses in the park. And it was a black guy. He said, no, I use it to practice my arm lifts. It's my exercise thing. And it was put up by two black guys. And they said, what noose? What are you talking about? That means that's demonization. And I think if you look at the people in NASA, how did NASA react? They called in the FBI. They took down the Confederate flag, which they should have. They went and hugged the driver and gave him a parade. I don't see that as racism. I mean, on the whole, the United States is a much less racist country than most European countries. And it's interesting that people want to pick on Israel, but they don't want to pick on Belgium, which is incredibly racist and has no real reason to exist. They don't want to pick on modern Germany, which has all sorts of problems. They don't want to look at France, whose police really do ignore anything that doesn't fit in with being really French. They don't look at some of the problems in Italy, where there are death notices all the time. Those are just ignored. We don't look at the concentration camps in China. No. We don't look, these are not, but this one little shtickler country that's willing to surrender almost everything for peace, and just for the statement that treat me as a human being, that's where we want to emphasize. What does that tell me?
Well, I would be the first one to say that religious freedom is not an important matter for the other areas of the Middle East, where you can't have Jews living in mostly Muslim countries because they would be kicked out or mistreated or blamed or killed. Or it's like people don't know the history of people fleeing Arab countries to get to Israel, so they wouldn't be. There was, they always talk about almost like group punishment or
collective punishment.
Yeah, and they never think that was what happens to Jews all the time, like in France, whenever.
And I'm in Mexico, and it's not always so great in Mexico.
Right.
So, so if you really want to be, so again, that comes out to the basic question I asked: are Jews human beings, and do they have the same rights as anybody else?
Let me ask you. Do you have any criticism on the right wing in Israel, like the current administration? Because
yeah, sure.
It's always hard to find criticism from the people that we agree with.
No, for example, I personally would not get into this whole stupidity, I think, of annexation. I think the Israeli rabbinate is composed of lunatics and has done more harm than good. So yeah, I have lots of criticisms within the Israeli system. The difference is Israel has elections. Matter of fact, they've had too many elections. And anyone who's lived in Israel would probably argue the difficulty of Israel, it's overly democratic. Everybody has the right to say everything. To the point where you're saying, please, let's have a little bit of order here. But do I think that the right makes major mistakes in Israel? Sure, I do. Do I think that Israel could have done a better job in the second level of integration of Ethiopians into Israeli society? Yes, I do. Do I think that Israel has to do a better job of accepting immigrants and helping them become part of the society? Yes, I do. On the other hand, what is the country that's accepted more immigrants from around the world than any other? Israel. What country helps people integrate better than any other country? Israel. So that doesn't mean but they're not angels. I think I started off saying it could be a holy land, but it's not all the people are holy. And if Mr. Netanyahu were to speak to me today, I would say, forget the silly annexation. It's going no place. You're just creating, or let's come up with some sort of trade. Maybe this part of the land is more important to Jews, this part is more important to Arabs. But in order to do that, you go to the central question. You cannot negotiate with me if I don't believe that you are not really a human being. And if in the end, my only ultimate goal is to kill you, you have a problem.
You think it's a religious extremist perspective that one group would lord over another and say that they're the chosen ones or they're the holy ones and the other person needs to be destroyed because they're not part of the caliphate or whatever? Or is it more of a resources question where people are fighting over the land and the water and the...
I think anti-Semitism is different than anti-Judaism. That starts in the 3rd century of Spain, if you know Spanish history. Mm-hmm. Anti-Judaism is that I'm having a epistemological fight. You say you own this envelope, I say I own the envelope. I could tear it in half, you could have it in the morning, I could have it in the afternoon, but we're fighting over the envelope. That's called an epistemological fight. Anti-Semitism is different. Anti-Semitism is ontological. It says, it doesn't matter who gets the envelope, I want you dead. And once you make the assumption, I want you dead, then everything else becomes impossible to negotiate. You can solve an epistemological problem. You can never solve an ontological problem.
Well, that leads us to the question of white supremacy. So people are throwing around the term white supremacy around. And again, if you overuse it, then the real white supremacists are not being separated from the rest of the population who, whatever issues we have going on in the US at this time, there might be disproportionate targeting of minorities. There might be issues against poor people. There might be very militarized police. But if you start saying that everybody is a white supremacist, then suddenly it becomes all us against them kind of. So it's almost like the call for a revolution to take down an oppressive system. My issue would be, and I think conservative community would agree, is that for it to be white supremacist, it would have to be systematic and it would have to be supported by the government, just like in Nazi Germany, where every police officer has been told, kill every Jew, black person,
whatever,
any minority, kill them.
You do not have systemic racism in the United States. You have some bad people. Racism will exist for all eternity because we're all somewhat different. Now, it would be nice if we could all be lovey-dovey, but it isn't going to happen. So we have to come up to some sort of, you don't have to love me. I do ask you to respect me. That's a difference. Notice the 10 Commandments does not order you to love your parents. It orders you to respect your parents. And respect means we can disagree and we can even philosophically argue it about, but I don't have the right to murder you. And we don't have a government, any government in this US, in this country ever, that's gone out with, and there are people I like. I voted, and by the way, I vote for Democrats and Republicans. I voted for Bill Clinton. And I voted for Jimmy Carter. I was sorry afterwards, but I voted for him. But I certainly, we have the right to change governments. We do in this country. The problem is when we don't recognize each other. In the United States, we've become captives of our vocabulary. Most police are not militarized. That's just not true. That's a lie. I work with the police every day. Most police spend most of their time helping the poor and the needy, filling up food banks, going out and helping with children. And if anyone doesn't believe that, come spend an evening with me.
Let me ask you, after 9/11, did you see a change because a lot of reports have been about the surplus military equipment has been given to police departments. Did you see that happen?
There are some police departments, such as New York, which happen to have anti-terrorism units. They have to. They don't have much choice. But the average police officer in the United States is not that way at all. Now, if we continue to beat up, let me ask you a different type of question. Do you have a son? I forgot.
I have 2 daughters.
Okay. Would you want your daughter to be a police officer?
Yeah.
Would you? Knowing she's going to be spit on, she's going to be shot, she can't probably be protected. She's going to have a left-wing society that's going to call her a fascist pig. Why do it?
For the community,
so then these people don't go in to be racist pigs. They go in for the community. You just answered your own question. And if we don't honor these people for all the wonderful things they do, we won't have them. And when you need them, they won't be there.
I do believe that police is important. The question is, do you see that some of the laws or the lack of laws do target certain populations? Because Martin Luther King said, the law does not force you to love me, but if it stops you from killing me.
Right, the law, Martin Luther King and I are on the exact same page.
So then, do you think there's laws now, like where they
So what laws are we talking about?
Where they catch
segregation it doesn't exist in the United States. Certainly, the worst thing you can call anybody in the United States is a racist. That goes against the American culture at this point. It's almost a religious, thou shalt not be a racist. So what laws are we talking about?
Well, give me an example. Mass incarceration of people with small crimes.
Yes, that was started by, who did that?
I know, like, again, it's not a liberal.
Where does it come from?
I know it was Clinton and even Biden and some of those guys.
Right, and it was from the Democratic Party that wanted to look tough on crime. Now, I'm the chaplain at the federal prison in Bryan. I would argue that maybe, and I'm at the female prison, so I'm not with men, I'm with females. But I would argue that probably 30 to 40% of those people, really there's no reason for them to be there. But this is things that do need to be changed, because we are suffering from Biden, we are suffering from Clinton. They wanted to create, think of the absurdity. If you are caught selling 2 ounces of marijuana for the 3rd time, you're going to go to prison for life, no parole. You would be smarter screaming on the street and killing the first person. I'm not recommending this. I want to make this very clear. But if you murdered someone, they say, oh, he was crazy, and let you out in 25 years. What type of crazy society puts people in jail for marijuana for life and puts them out in 25 years for prison? For murder.
And it's usually poor people that don't have access to good attorneys to get them
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with you.
Would you say that there's a caste system that is working against the poor more than a racial system?
Yeah, it's not racial, it's poor. I work in a prison. We have lots of poor white women. The majority of the people in prison are white women, in my prison. But they had court-appointed little attorneys who got their pay no matter what. They really didn't care. It's like socialized medicine. If you don't have a relationship with the doctor, in the end, you're going to have lousy medicine. Were Bernie Sanders to have gotten his way on socialized medicine, you'd have a lot of sick people.
So don't they have socialized medicine in Israel?
Half and half. Okay. Socialized medicine in the morning. It's you pick your own doctor in the afternoon.
Okay, so they've made a happy medium there.
Yeah, they did. The logic was, but it's also a different situation. You have a country of 10 million people versus a country of 300 million people. It's a different equation.
How is Israeli socialism different than the socialism of Bernie Sanders?
It's a different country. Most Israelis have pretty much given up on socialism. You remember the country was going bankrupt under socialism, in the Labor Party, and there are a lot of things I don't like about Netanyahu. But one of the things he did do is he turned the economy around. And Israel went from a country that had to ask for money to a country that's giving money. What was the only country to give money to Houston after the hurricane? Actually, there were 2. I was wrong.
Well, I know that they donated a lot of money to the Jewish neighborhoods.
And they gave another $1 million to the city of Houston to use as it was needed. There are only 2 countries that did it, Mexico and Israel.
It's interesting in Mexico because they don't take care of their own people.
That's right. But it was but the bottom line is that Israel went from being I don't know when the last time, or if you've been to Israel, but Israel went from being a very poor country, you saw a 2-lane road, it was like a marvel, to a country with super highways. Now, that couldn't take place under socialism. So, yes, socialism was probably needed in Israel in the 1950s and 60s. I would agree, because they were incapable of starting an airline or a train system or a bus system. The state had to do it. But then there comes a time, just like, when you're a child, you need to have diapers. Then you go to clothes. Then you eventually go to high school. Eventually, you can leave your parents' home and earn your own way. The same thing takes place in countries. Socialism works when you're an infant. Eventually, you have to grow up.
So do you have any suggestions for bettering the relationships between communities of color and poor communities and the police? Because, I would go visit my friends at the barrio, and I would say hi to the police, and all my friends were like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, they're protecting us, or at least they're trying." And they would say, "No, you don't talk to the police. You don't say hi."
So there are a number of things that need to be done. Certainly, we do it here in College Station. But one, the police have to probably stick their hand out first, because at this point, even if they are not racist, in tourism, we say perception becomes reality. So if they're suffering from a negative perception, they have to break the mold. Somebody's got to break it, and it's going to have to be the police. Secondly, they have to work with the community and listen to see what the community needs. Thirdly, I'm a strong believer in having the community work with police in determining how budgets are used and what the goals are. Fourthly, they need to work with the Black churches, because the Black churches have tremendous power within the Black community, and they need to coordinate so that there's a common set of goals. Now, there's some things, most Blacks want a safe, healthy society, just like most whites, Asians, Latinos, whatever. I think most people don't want their kids to be shot. Look what happened in Chicago last weekend. 114 people shot, 14 dead. I believe those are the correct numbers, including a 3-year-old child. Tell me one politician who said Black Lives Matter. Tell me one. You know about what happened in Minneapolis? What's the name of the little girl who was murdered in Chicago last weekend? At 3.
Going on for a while. So I don't know what's happening in Chicago that is.
Why don't you know? The question is not that you don't know. The question is, why have the media not decided to choose a place where Blacks are getting murdered on a daily basis? And your answer is, well, it's going on. It's just normal. No, it's not. That's racism. To not know is racism in this case. Why are we so worried about, and believe me, I didn't feel terrible what the police did in Minneapolis was wrong. I'm not trying to defend that in any way at all. But why do we know about this one person, but 114 people, we don't know one person's name, including little children? And they're also Black.
Let me ask you about the Israeli community. I know people conflate all Israelis with all Jews, religious Jews, non-religious, all that. But what can the Jewish community or the pro-Israel community do to better relationships? Because what you see a lot is that the relationship between the African-American community and the Jewish community has been broken. And now there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of resentment. What can be done to fix that?
So first of all, I don't work as much with the African-American community as I work with the Latino community. But I run an organization in Houston called the Center for Latino-Jewish Relations, where we take Jews to Mexico or Spain to learn about Latino culture, and we take Latino leaders to Israel to learn about Jewish culture. We probably need an equal thing between Blacks and Jews. Most Blacks don't know a lot about Black culture. So one of the things that we need is better education. That means taking people to Ghana, which has a program very similar to Israel with the law of return, of taking people, of Black leaders to Israel. I have done some of that. I ran a series in College Station of speaking about commonalities in one of the local Black churches here. And what I did is I lectured on the book of Exodus, because I pointed out only 2 groups of people can understand the book of Exodus, Jews and Blacks, because we're the only 2 groups that have shared a slave experience. though I don't expect reparations for the pyramids. But I like it. But we're the only two groups that have a shared slave experience. So only Blacks can really understand the Book of Exodus as Jews do. Only Blacks can truly understand the Passover Seder the way Jews do. That means we need to create those types of situations. We also need to create situations where Jewish and Black leaders actually speak. Now, it's going to be impossible to speak to every Black in the United States. It's just, you can't do that. But you can speak to the churches and the leadership and the opinion makers of those people who want there to be peace. But remember, Jews were the number one people who supported Blacks for the right in the 1960s in the fight against segregation. And that alliance was very strong until John Lindsay of New York, who was the mayor, who was a white Protestant, worked hard to create fights in Belford-Stuyvesant between Jews and Blacks. One of the things that both Jews and Blacks need to do is go back and learn that history.
Last thing, you mentioned that there's a very complicated history from all different groups. So
yes,
regarding statues, I feel that some statues need to go, but like you said, if they start going after everybody, they are going to find Native American people who had slaves. They're going to find African freed slaves who had slaves. They're going to find
and
everybody.
You know what? I would rather have a statue of a jerk, somebody I disagree with, and then use that statue as a teaching tool to tell people why this guy was lousy. Because if I erase him from history, no one's ever going to know he existed and that he was bad.
Okay. We'll leave it at that.
All right.
Well, thank you so much.
I hope this will get you lots of listeners.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
One thing that we didn't discuss is that a lot of these monuments have been put up by segregationists and by people who are very proud of the Southern heritage that usually involved the ownership of slaves or the battle of secession against the rest of the country. So why have these monuments to begin with? And they're in public spaces. If they're on private property, you can have a statue, anybody you want to worship or bow down to, whatever. But if you're going to have it in a public space, I think there has to be an understanding that this represents all of us. So you shouldn't rub it in people's face that there was these leaders who were trying to enslave or keep people in slavery. So I hope that people will look at this show with an open mind and that they will support the work that we do by staying tuned and giving us a chance. There's a lot of programs out there, but ours, we do an honest discussion about these topics, and we want to be able to bring people together from different perspectives. So thank you again for listening, and we will be back next week with another edition of the Mystic and the Skeptic.